Close your eyes and let us drift back in time to the late 19th century in America, a land of endless opportunity, smoky skies, and the hum of industry. This is the story of John D. Rockefeller. In the year 1839, in the quiet town of Richford, New York, a child was born who would one day shape the destiny of an entire nation's economy. His name was John Davison Rockefeller. But in that moment, he was only a fragile infant, swaddled in the arms of his mother, unaware of the vast world waiting beyond the wooden walls of his modest home. The United States was a country still finding itself, a republic only a little more than 60 years old, expanding westward, full of promise, hardship, and uncertainty. Life was slower, simpler, and harder. Families rose with the sun and labored until dusk. Most people lived close to the land, farming, trading, or working with their hands. It was into this environment that John took his first breaths. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a restless man, a traveling salesman who wandered from place to place, always searching for opportunity, always moving, rarely still. He was charming, persuasive, and unpredictable. To some, he was a clever merchant; to others, a man who relied more on schemes than honest labor. His absences were long and frequent, and though his presence carried a certain charisma, his unreliability left deep impressions on the family he often left behind. His mother, Eliza Davison Rockefeller, was the opposite in almost every way. She was deeply religious, steady, disciplined, and guided by strong principles. While William drifted, Eliza anchored. She carried the weight of raising her children with care, instilling in them a sense of order, morality, and responsibility. It was Eliza's influence that shaped young John most profoundly. She believed in the virtues of hard work, thrift, and faith. She taught her children to live modestly, to save when they could, and to avoid unnecessary indulgence. She often repeated to John the simple lesson that willpower and self-discipline were more valuable than fleeting pleasures. The child listened closely. He was quiet, observant, and serious beyond his years. In his eyes, there was already a hunger for stability, a yearning to create for himself a life more secure than the one offered by his father's uncertain wanderings. Childhood for John was not one of abundance. The family moved several times, as William's restless pursuits kept them unsettled. Each new place meant new challenges, new neighbors, and new adjustments. For some children, such instability might have bred recklessness, but for John, it seemed only to sharpen his desire for control. He began to seek order in small things, routine in daily chores, neatness in his belongings, precision in his schoolwork. He quickly understood that even if the larger world seemed unreliable, a person could still cultivate discipline within themselves. His early education was modest. He attended local schools, sometimes small and simple one-room schoolhouses where children of many ages sat together. He was not a loud or boastful student, but he was diligent. Teachers noticed his seriousness and his steady progress. Numbers fascinated him. Arithmetic, with its certainty, its clarity, and its rules, appealed to his mind. He liked the way numbers always added up, the way they brought order out of confusion. He began to keep small records, copying figures, noting sums, and balancing small accounts, as though the world itself might be set in order by carefully written lines on paper. As John grew into adolescence, his awareness of money deepened. He performed small jobs to earn a few coins, helping neighbors, raising turkeys, doing chores. He quickly learned the satisfaction of keeping track of what he earned and how it was spent. Unlike many children who might spend their coins on sweets or amusements, John recorded his earnings in a small ledger. Each entry was made carefully, every cent accounted for. It was not only about saving, it was about creating a sense of stability, a record of progress, proof that life could be organized even in the face of uncertainty. This habit became one of the defining features of his character, a practice he would carry throughout his long life. The contrast between his parents' influences shaped him deeply. From his father, John saw charm and ambition, but also unreliability and risk. From his mother, he absorbed steadiness, morality, and restraint. In the balance of these two figures, John quietly chose the path of order. He preferred to be careful, cautious, deliberate. He did not trust luck or chance. He trusted preparation, discipline, and planning. The America of his youth was not yet the industrial giant it would soon become. It was still an agrarian society, dotted with small towns and farms, but change was in the air. Canals connected waterways, railroads were beginning to spread, and the nation was inching toward modernity. Young John could not have fully known it yet, but the opportunities of this new age would reward the kind of discipline he was already cultivating. The chaotic energy of expansion would need men who could bring order to it, and he was preparing himself, quietly and carefully, for just such a role. As a teenager, he began to look for more serious work. At 16, he found his first position as a clerk in Cleveland, Ohio, earning just a few dollars a week. It was a modest beginning, but for John, it was the doorway to the world he had been imagining. His duties included calculating figures, recording transactions, and keeping financial records for the firm. To some, such work might have seemed dull or tedious. To John, it was a natural fit. He relished the precision, the reliability of numbers. Every day at his desk was a chance to put order into the world. He wore simple, neat clothes and carried himself with a seriousness that belied his youth. He did not complain, he did not boast. He simply worked, steadily and quietly, earning the respect of his employers. Even at this young age, he kept his personal finances with the same rigor he applied to his job. He wrote down every cent of his income and every cent of his expenses. He set aside money for savings, determined to build a foundation for the future. While others his age might spend freely or think little of tomorrow, John thought constantly about stability, growth, and discipline. He once said that he always tried to turn every disaster into an opportunity. That philosophy began here, in the quiet offices of Cleveland, where he learned that steadiness and careful management could transform uncertainty into progress. At home, he remained devoted to his mother. Eliza's lessons stayed with him. He attended church, sang hymns, and absorbed the moral framework she had instilled. He believed that wealth, if it ever came to him, must be used wisely and with responsibility. His faith reinforced his sense of discipline. The idea that every action was watched by God, that every choice had moral weight, only strengthened his resolve to live carefully, purposefully, and modestly. His father's presence was irregular, sometimes inspiring, sometimes disappointing. When William appeared, he often carried with him stories, energy, and a certain charm, but his absences and unpredictable ways left John with little sense of security. Rather than imitate his father, he quietly resolved never to live in such a manner. He would be dependable, consistent, reliable. He would not gamble with his life or the lives of those who depended on him. The boy who watched his father drift away time and again determined that he would root himself firmly, never allowing uncertainty to rule him. As the years of his youth passed, these lessons crystallized. He grew into a young man of quiet intensity, one who smiled rarely but observed everything. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to calculate before he acted, and to plan before he leapt. Friends and acquaintances noticed his seriousness, his calm presence, and his habit of saving money when others spent it. Some teased him for being overly cautious, but John cared little for their opinions. He saw the world as a place where discipline would prevail, and he was determined to be among those who lived with discipline. This foundation, built slowly in the small towns of New York and Ohio, formed the bedrock of Rockefeller's later empire. But for now he was still just a boy, growing into manhood, guided by the gentle hand of his mother, tested by the uncertainties of his father, and shaped by the simple, profound lessons of thrift, work, and faith. When we look back at the life of John D. Rockefeller, it is easy to see the empire, the billions, the vast reach of Standard Oil, but behind that immense success lies the quiet story of a boy who learned early the power of discipline, the importance of order, and the strength of steady progress. His childhood was not gilded with wealth, but it was rich in lessons that would serve him all his life. In the flickering lamplight of his youth, in the small schoolhouses and modest homes of his early years, John Rockefeller was preparing himself, step by careful step, for a destiny he could not yet imagine. And as we drift into this memory of the past, we see not the titan of industry he would become, but the boy who kept his coins carefully in a ledger, who listened to his mother's teachings, and who watched the world around him with quiet, calculating eyes. In that boy lay the seeds of discipline, and in that discipline lay the power to shape a future far greater than the modest beginnings from which he came. In the quiet countryside of upstate New York, the rhythm of life was slow and deliberate. The seasons marked the passing of time more clearly than calendars. Winter brought silence and snowdrifts. Spring awakened the fields with soft rains. Summer filled the days with heat and harvest, and autumn painted the trees in shades of fire before surrendering again to the cold. Families lived by this rhythm, working the soil, tending to livestock, and surviving with little luxury. It was in such a world that John D. Rockefeller opened his eyes to life. He was the second of 6 children, a boy who grew up in a household where money was often scarce and uncertainty common. His father, William, was rarely content to remain in one place. He sold elixirs and remedies, traveling from town to town, often with a silver tongue and a clever smile. Some admired his ability to persuade, others distrusted the shadow of trickery that followed him. His absences left the home in a state of waiting, never knowing when he might return or what stories he might bring when he did. His mother, Eliza, was the steady heart of the family. With her, the children found consistency. She was deeply religious, her faith woven into the fabric of daily life. Each morning and evening carried prayers. Each day carried lessons of thrift and morality. She spoke to her children about the value of honesty, the necessity of saving, and the importance of hard work. She told them that riches could be fleeting, but character would endure. John, quiet and thoughtful, absorbed these teachings like seeds planted in fertile soil. From an early age, John was given chores. He carried water, tended to animals, helped in the garden, and learned that each task, however small, was part of the family's survival. He was not particularly strong or adventurous, but he was meticulous. If a bucket of water needed to be filled, he made sure it was filled properly. If a row of plants needed weeding, he pulled each weed carefully. He learned that consistency mattered more than bursts of effort. This idea that steady, patient work could outlast chaos became a guiding principle of his life. He also learned the importance of money. His mother gave him small coins for small jobs, and he treasured them as if they were rare jewels. While other children might have spent them quickly, John saved. He placed his coins carefully in a box, counted them, and then counted again. He loved the feeling of watching the sum grow, however slowly. In time, he began keeping a little notebook, writing down his earnings and his expenses. balancing the numbers with the seriousness of an accountant. For a child, it was an unusual habit. For John, it was the beginning of a lifelong practice of discipline and order. School was a modest affair. In the one-room schoolhouses of his youth, John sat with children of all ages. The teacher gave lessons on reading, writing, and arithmetic, moving from one group of pupils to another. John was not the most outspoken or lively student, but he was attentive. He preferred arithmetic, finding comfort in the way numbers obeyed rules. Words could be uncertain, opinions could change, but numbers were steady. He carried this love of order with him, letting it shape not only his schoolwork, but also his view of the world. His father's absences were both a source of pain and a source of determination. Each time William disappeared for weeks or months, the family was left to manage on their own. Eliza stretched what little they had, teaching her children to do without. John noticed. He saw that charm and cleverness could win attention for a while, but without discipline and responsibility, they left behind instability. The boy quietly promised himself that he would not live as his father did. He would not gamble, he would not wander, he would not leave those who depended on him uncertain. He would be steady, he would be reliable. He would root his life in habits that could not be shaken. By the time he reached his teenage years, John's seriousness was well known. Neighbors remarked on his maturity. He was not reckless, not prone to mischief, but instead seemed always to be watching, calculating, considering. At the age of 13, he took on more responsibility, raising a small flock of turkeys and selling them to neighbors. He learned how to negotiate prices, how to care for the birds, and how to balance the money he made. It was a small venture, but to John it was training, a lesson in enterprise, thrift, and persistence. The world around him was changing. The 1840s and 1850s were decades of growth and tension in America. The Erie Canal had opened, linking the Great Lakes to the Atlantic and fueling commerce in New York and Ohio. Railroads were beginning to crisscross the countryside, speeding goods and people in ways unimagined just a generation before. Cities were swelling, factories were rising, and whispers of westward expansion carried dreams of opportunity across the land. Young John watched these changes with wide eyes. He could sense that the country was moving towards something larger, faster, and more complex. And though he was only a boy, he felt a stirring within himself that he wanted to be part of it. At 16, he secured his first real job in Cleveland, working as an assistant bookkeeper for a produce firm. The office was a modest one, filled with ledgers, ink, and the smell of paper. His tasks were simple but vital, recording transactions, balancing accounts, checking figures. For John, it was a dream. To sit at a desk, pen in hand, bringing order to the flow of money, this was exactly what he had prepared himself for. He worked long hours, often arriving before others and staying after they left. He dressed neatly, carried himself with seriousness, and avoided frivolity. His employers noticed his dedication and his quiet competence. He earned 50 cents a day, a humble wage, but he treated each coin with reverence. He continued to record every expense, every saving. He set himself the goal of saving $100, and when he finally reached it, he celebrated not with extravagance, but with renewed determination. That $100 was proof that discipline could accumulate, that small steps could build into something lasting. He once said later in life that this first $100 was the hardest he ever earned, but also the most important. It gave him the confidence that he could grow, that he could build, that he could endure. Even as he worked, he remained faithful to the lessons of his mother. He attended church regularly, sang hymns with the congregation, and listened intently to sermons about morality and service. He believed deeply that life was guided by a higher power, and that wealth, if it ever came to him, would be a trust to be used wisely. His faith gave him comfort, but it also gave him direction. It taught him that indulgence was dangerous, that responsibility was sacred, and that a man's true measure was not in what he possessed, but in how he used it. Through these years, Rockefeller grew into a man whose identity was already forming. He was cautious yet ambitious, humble yet determined, quiet yet unshakably focused. His beginnings had been modest, his family often uncertain, but he carried within himself the steady rhythm of discipline that would guide him all his life. In the dim light of Cleveland offices, as he bent over ledgers and balanced accounts, the foundations of America's first billionaire were quietly being laid. When he looked back on his youth many years later, Rockefeller often spoke with gratitude for the lessons of those early days. He believed that the hardships of his childhood, the strict discipline of his mother, and the responsibility he carried as a boy had been blessings in disguise. They had forged in him the habits of order, thrift, and faith that no amount of wealth could ever replace. He would later tell his children and grandchildren stories of how he had saved every penny, of how he had raised turkeys, of how he had celebrated his first $100. To him, these stories were not mere memories, they were parables, guiding truths that shaped the path of his entire life. And so, as we let our minds wander back to that boy in Richford, New York, we do not see yet the titan of oil, the master of industry, the first billionaire of America. We see instead a quiet child sitting by lamplight, carefully writing numbers in a notebook, listening to the voice of his mother as she spoke of honesty, of saving, of faith. We see a boy watching his father depart yet again, vowing silently that he would not follow such a path. We see a teenager counting his coins, dreaming not of sudden riches but of steady growth. We see discipline, patience, and faith taking root in the heart of a young man who would one day, through these very qualities, shape the destiny of a nation. And in this picture there is calm, there is the slow unfolding of life, the quiet lessons of youth, the patient building of character. It is a reminder that greatness often begins not with noise or spectacle, but with small habits, simple choices, and steady discipline. The boy who saved his pennies and balanced his ledgers became the man who built an empire, and all of it began in those early years, in the quiet rhythms of a modest home, under the steady guidance of a mother's hand, and in the shadow of a father whose absence taught him the value of presence. When John D. Rockefeller stepped into his youth, he was already carrying habits that set him apart from many around him. Where others looked at life with carefree spontaneity, he approached it with precision, a seriousness beyond his age. The boy who had once raised turkeys and saved coins in a little box now entered the world of work, and with each passing year, his habits of discipline deepened. His story in these years is not one of great drama or sudden fortune, but of quiet routines, steady effort, and the patient building of a foundation that would carry him far beyond what he could yet imagine. At 16, he found himself in Cleveland, hired as an assistant bookkeeper for a produce commission firm called Hewitt and Tuttle. For most boys his age, such a position might have been considered dull, a place of ledgers and ink stains, of endless rows of numbers. But for John, it was a world of order and possibility. He loved the careful act of writing in neat script, the balancing of accounts, the clarity of transactions. Each line entered into a ledger was like a small victory of discipline over chaos. He sat at his desk with a seriousness that surprised his employers, and though his pay was meager, just 50 cents a day, he treated each coin as if it were a treasure. The young clerk was punctual. He arrived before others, prepared for the day, and often stayed late, finishing tasks with meticulous care. He did not chatter idly, nor did he rush through his work. He moved steadily, calmly, as if each figure recorded was a step in a larger journey only he could see. His employers soon realized they could rely on him. While others might make careless errors, Rockefeller's entries were precise. He did not leave room for chance. His reputation grew quietly, not through boastfulness, but through competence. What set him most apart, however, was not only how he worked, but how he lived outside of work. Even as a young man, he recorded every penny of income and every penny of expense. He kept a small ledger of his own finances, writing down with the same care he applied to the firm's accounts the details of his daily life. If he spent 5 cents on a newspaper, it was recorded. If he earned $1 from his wages, it was entered with pride. Each month, he would review his notebook, calculating how much he had saved, how much he had spent, and how much he could plan for the future. It may seem like a small habit, but for Rockefeller, it was a philosophy of life. To him, money was not simply coins and paper. It was a measure of discipline, a symbol of security, and a tool for building. While many of his peers spent freely, indulging in small luxuries, John found joy in saving. He believed that every cent kept was a brick laid in the foundation of stability. Over time, this habit of careful record keeping and steady saving would grow into one of the most defining features of his character. His life in these years was simple and modest. He rented a small room, wore plain but neat clothes, and avoided extravagance. He often walked to work, enjoying the rhythm of his steps, using the time to think quietly. He rarely joined in youthful revelries, preferring instead the calm satisfaction of watching his savings grow. Some of his friends teased him for being overly serious, calling him stingy or old-fashioned. But John did not mind. He was not seeking their approval. He was seeking stability. There is a story that he once lent a small sum of money to a fellow clerk who was struggling. The man promised to repay him, but delayed again and again. John recorded the loan in his ledger and noted each delay. In time, the man finally repaid him, and John entered the repayment with satisfaction. To him, it was not just about the money, but about the principle. He had learned patience, he had practiced discipline, and he had proven to himself that careful records brought accountability. These habits extended beyond money. Rockefeller believed in order in all things. He rose early, valuing the quiet hours of the morning. He believed that a man should begin his day with purpose, not idleness. He ate simple meals, never indulging in excess. He walked often, enjoying fresh air and the chance to clear his thoughts. Even in youth, he valued health and moderation, avoiding the recklessness that claimed so many young men. His faith guided him too. He attended church regularly, contributing small amounts of his limited earnings to the collection plate. To him, giving was as important as saving. He believed that wealth, however small, carried responsibility. His employers recognized his reliability, and as the months passed, they entrusted him with more responsibility. He negotiated small deals, corresponded with clients, and managed increasingly complex accounts. He did so with the same calm precision, never rushing, never gambling, always steady. In these moments, the habits of a young man became the training ground for the leader he would one day become. Outside of work, Rockefeller often reflected on his future. He dreamed not of sudden riches or daring adventures, but of steady progress. He believed that fortune came not to those who chased it wildly, but to those who built it brick by brick. He once set himself the goal of saving $1,000, a vast sum for a young clerk. To him, it was not just a number. It was a symbol of independence, a sign that he could control his destiny. Each day at his desk, each careful entry in his ledger was a step toward that goal. The discipline he practiced gave him a sense of calm confidence. He was not afraid of the future because he trusted his own habits. He knew that no matter what storms life might bring, his records, his savings, and his steady character would see him through. This quiet assurance was visible to others. People who met him noticed his calm demeanor, his lack of arrogance, his willingness to listen more than he spoke. They sensed that beneath his modest appearance lay a man of unusual strength, not the strength of muscle, but the strength of discipline. In these years, the seeds of his empire were not yet visible. There were no oil wells, no towering fortunes, no vast enterprises. There was only a young man at a desk, pen in hand, ledger open, saving a few coins, planning for the future. But in that quiet scene lay the essence of John D. Rockefeller's greatness, for he understood even then that life was built not on sudden bursts of brilliance, but on steady habits, repeated faithfully, day after day. The world around him continued to change. Railroads grew, cities expanded, commerce quickened, but Rockefeller moved at his own pace, calm and steady, like a river carving its path not through force but through persistence. He did not chase opportunities recklessly. He prepared himself so that when opportunity came, he would be ready. And so, as we imagine him in those early years, we see not yet the billionaire, but the young clerk with a notebook in his pocket, carefully recording his pennies, quietly shaping his habits, patiently building the foundation of a life that would one day astonish the world. His story in youth is a reminder that greatness begins not with wealth or fame, but with small habits practiced faithfully, with discipline embraced willingly, with patience carried like a lantern into the unknown future. In the stillness of those evenings, when he sat alone with his accounts, Rockefeller was writing more than numbers. He was writing the story of a life built on order, discipline, and faith. And it is in those habits of a young man that we see the first glimmers of America's first billionaire, not yet realized, but already inevitable in the steady march of his character. In the middle of the 19th century, America was a land of restless energy. The young republic was stretching outward, its frontiers pushing westward, its cities swelling with factories, its railroads threading across the plains like veins of iron. The hum of industry mingled with the steady rhythm of horse hooves on cobblestone streets, the hiss of steam engines, the murmur of merchants calling their wares. It was an age of invention, ambition, and uncertainty. And within this restless age, a young man named John D. Rockefeller was quietly preparing to make his mark. By the early 1860s, Rockefeller was no longer the boy recording pennies in his ledger, nor merely the clerk balancing accounts for others. He had already ventured into business, forming a small partnership in produce trading. He bought and sold grain, meats, and other goods, working tirelessly, always watching the flow of money and goods with the eyes of someone who prized order above all else. Cleveland, where he lived, was a growing city, its position near Lake Erie and its rail connections making it a hub of trade. The Civil War was raging, and the demand for supplies was immense. Rockefeller's business prospered not through reckless speculation, but through steady contracts and careful management. Yet even as he succeeded in the produce trade, the currents of change were carrying him toward a new frontier, one that would soon dominate the world. In Pennsylvania, in the quiet town of Titchesville, something strange had been discovered in 1859. A well, drilled into the earth, had struck a dark, sticky liquid that seeped upward. It was crude oil, long known to seep naturally from rocks, but now drawn deliberately from the depths of the earth. At first, people were uncertain what to do with it. It was messy, it smelled, and it seemed a nuisance. But soon, they learned to refine it into kerosene, a substance that burned brightly and cheaply in lamps. At a time when much of America still lit its nights with whale oil or candles, kerosene promised to illuminate homes and cities at a fraction of the cost. Word spread quickly, and with it came a rush of excitement. The oil regions of Pennsylvania became scenes of frenzy. Speculators rushed in, eager to drill wells, to claim land, to strike it rich. Derricks sprouted like weeds, and fortunes seemed to rise and fall overnight. There was chaos everywhere, muddy streets filled with barrels, men shouting, deals struck in haste, wells gushing one day and running dry the next. Prices soared and collapsed in wild cycles. For many, the oil business was a gamble, a fever, a chance to win or lose everything in an instant. Rockefeller watched this from Cleveland, his keen eyes seeing what others missed. He saw not just the excitement, but the disorder. He saw wasted oil spilling into rivers, fires consuming entire wells, fortunes disappearing as quickly as they were made. To most, oil was a game of luck. To Rockefeller, it was a field in need of discipline. He believed that chaos could be tamed, that the wild rush of the oil business could be brought under control by careful planning, steady management, and relentless efficiency. He did not rush to the oil fields himself. Instead, he looked to the part of the business where his talents could shine. Refining. Crude oil by itself was of little use, but refined into kerosene, it became a commodity of immense value. Rockefeller understood that while wells might boom and bust, the need for refined oil would only grow. He invested carefully, entering into the refining business in Cleveland. There, on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, he built his first refinery. It was not the largest, but it was the most efficient. He demanded that every process be done with precision, every waste minimized, every cost controlled. His refinery produced kerosene more cheaply and more reliably than most of his competitors. The young Rockefeller applied the same habits he had practiced since boyhood. He kept meticulous records, monitored every expense, and reinvested profits into improving his operations. Where others squandered money on speculation or luxuries, Rockefeller poured his earnings back into his business. He inspected barrels, watched the flow of oil, and insisted that nothing be wasted. Even the byproducts of refining, which others threw away, he found uses for lubricants, paraffin, and other materials that could be sold. To him, waste was not only a financial loss but a moral failure. As the Civil War ended and the nation turned to growth and rebuilding, the demand for kerosene soared. Families across America lit their homes with it, cities filled their lamps with it, and exports carried it across the seas. Rockefeller's refineries grew, and with each year he tightened his grip on efficiency. He partnered with men who shared his vision, men like Henry Flagler, who brought both capital and insight into the growing enterprise. Together, they expanded operations, always with the same guiding principles: discipline, efficiency, and long-term planning. But Rockefeller's genius lay not only in refining oil, but in understanding the broader picture of business. He saw that transportation cost, shipping oil by rail or boat, were a major burden. He negotiated with railroads, securing favorable rates for shipping large quantities. His ability to strike such deals gave him an advantage over competitors, and he used that advantage to grow stronger. He reinvested constantly, expanding his refineries, buying out weaker rivals, and bringing more of the industry under his control. To the outside world, the oil business remained volatile. Prices continued to rise and fall with dramatic swings. Fortunes continued to come and go. But within Rockefeller's growing empire, there was stability. He had imposed order on chaos. His refineries ran smoothly, his costs were low, his distribution secure. Customers trusted that his kerosene would be of consistent quality, sold at a reliable price. In an industry plagued by uncertainty, Standard Oil, as his company came to be called, offered dependability. The rise of Standard Oil was not sudden, but it was relentless. Year by year, Rockefeller expanded his reach. He bought competitors not with violence but with persuasion, offering them fair prices to sell, or the chance to join his growing network. Many, weary of the volatility of the oil business, accepted. Each acquisition added strength to his empire. Each refinery brought under his control another step toward stability. By the 1870s, Rockefeller's Standard Oil dominated refining in Cleveland and soon across the nation. His methods were often misunderstood. To some, he seemed ruthless, eliminating competition and consolidating power, but to Rockefeller, it was not ruthlessness, it was order. He believed that the waste and chaos of too many small, inefficient refineries harmed the industry, harmed consumers, and harmed progress. By bringing them together under one disciplined system, he believed he was serving a greater good. His goal was not merely profit, but efficiency, stability, and growth. Through these years, Rockefeller himself lived much as he always had. He rose early, worked steadily, avoided extravagance. While his wealth grew, he did not indulge in flamboyant displays. His clothes remained plain, his habits simple. He believed that his fortune was a trust, not a toy. Even in the midst of building one of the greatest business empires in history, he attended church faithfully, gave generously to charity, and lived modestly with his family. His outward life seemed calm, even ordinary, while within his business he was shaping the foundation of modern industry. The oil industry of the 19th century could easily have remained a reckless, boom and bust affair, a place where fortunes rose and fell like dice cast on a table. But under Rockefeller's influence, it became something different. It became an industry of stability, discipline, and vast reach. His vision extended far beyond Cleveland, far beyond Pennsylvania. He saw oil flowing to every corner of America, carried by railroads and pipelines, lighting homes and factories, powering the engines of a new age, and he saw Standard Oil as the disciplined heart of that system, the force that could give order to the chaos of a rapidly changing world. By the time the 1870s and 1880s unfolded, Standard Oil was not just a company but an empire. Rockefeller controlled the majority of refining in the United States. His influence touched railroads, shipping, pipelines, and markets across the globe. And yet, the habits of his youth, the careful ledgers, the steady savings, the avoidance of waste remained at the center of everything. The empire of oil rested upon the same foundation that had begun with a boy's notebook and a few carefully saved coins. Looking back, one can see that the rise of oil was not simply the story of a natural resource discovered in Pennsylvania. It was the story of a man who saw in that resource a field in need of order, a chaos in need of discipline. Where others saw opportunity for quick fortunes, Rockefeller saw the chance to build something lasting. His calm, deliberate habits turned the frenzy of oil into the stability of an industry. And in doing so, he not only became America's first billionaire, but also reshaped the very way modern business would be conducted. And so, as we drift with this story, we can imagine the oil fields of Pennsylvania filled with noisy derricks and muddy roads, men shouting and barrels rolling, fortunes made and lost. And then, away from the noise, we see a man in Cleveland, sitting at a desk, pen in hand, quietly calculating, patiently refining, bringing order to the storm. That man, John D. Rockefeller, did not chase oil with wild abandon. He tamed it with discipline, and in doing so, he changed the world. When John D. Rockefeller reached the height of his power in the late 19th century, he was no longer merely a successful businessman, but a figure who seemed almost larger than life. Standard Oil had grown into an empire that touched every corner of American life, refining the oil that lit homes, fueled industry, and carried goods across oceans. With this empire came a fortune so vast that ordinary people struggled to imagine it. Yet Rockefeller himself remained, in many ways, the same quiet, disciplined man he had been since his youth. His fortune, however, was not just a measure of wealth. It became the instrument through which he shaped his reputation, his legacy, and the very landscape of philanthropy in America. In his daily life, Rockefeller maintained a striking modesty. He rose early, kept regular habits, and continued to live in a manner that seemed restrained compared to the grandeur available to him. He enjoyed golf, long walks, and the company of his family. His meals were simple, his clothes plain. Even when his wealth had reached levels no American had known before, he avoided extravagance. He saw money not as a means for indulgence, but as a tool, a responsibility, a trust. From the beginning of his career, he had believed that riches came with a duty to use them wisely, and as his fortune grew, that belief only deepened. At first, Rockefeller gave quietly, supporting his church, local charities, and educational institutions. He believed in systematic giving, in careful and thoughtful contributions rather than impulsive acts. Just as he demanded order in his business, he sought order in his philanthropy. He studied causes, asked questions, and tried to ensure that every dollar given would bring lasting benefit. He was guided by a deep sense of faith, nurtured by his devout Baptist upbringing. To him, wealth was entrusted by God, and it was his duty to distribute it in ways that served others and honored that trust. Over time, the scale of his giving grew. He supported universities, including the founding of the University of Chicago, which he envisioned as a great institution of learning in the Midwest. His contributions transformed it into one of the leading universities in the world. He funded medical research, endowing institutions that studied diseases and sought cures. He supported public health campaigns that reduced the spread of illnesses like hookworm, malaria, and yellow fever. He gave to libraries, churches, and missions, spreading the reach of education and faith across communities large and small. Yet while Rockefeller gave vast sums to causes that shaped the modern world, the public's perception of him was not simple. To many, he was the embodiment of the ruthless capitalist, the monopolist who had crushed competition and built his empire on the backs of smaller businesses. Journalists and politicians accused Standard Oil of unfair practices, of striking secret deals with railroads, of driving rivals to ruin. Stories circulated of men who had lost everything while Rockefeller grew richer. To these critics, he was not a benefactor but a symbol of greed. The contrast between Rockefeller the philanthropist and Rockefeller the monopolist created a tension that lasted throughout his life. Newspapers often portrayed him as a cold, calculating figure, distant from the struggles of ordinary people. Cartoons drew him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around the oil industry, the railroads, the government itself. The image of the robber baron clung to him, as it did to many industrialists of the Gilded Age. Yet at the same time, countless institutions, scholars, and communities benefited from his generosity. Schools were built, diseases eradicated, and knowledge advanced because of his gifts. For Rockefeller himself, the criticism did not alter his conviction. He believed deeply that his methods in business had brought order and efficiency, reducing waste and lowering prices for consumers. He argued that his work had made oil more affordable and more reliable for millions of people, and that the stability of Standard Oil had benefited the nation. Where others saw monopoly, he saw consolidation for the sake of progress. Where others accused him of greed, he believed he had been frugal and faithful, careful with money so that it could be used to greater purpose. As he aged, his focus shifted more fully from business to philanthropy. Having retired from active management of Standard Oil, he dedicated himself to giving away his fortune. He once remarked that it was harder to give money away wisely than it was to earn it, and he devoted as much thought and care to his philanthropy as he had to his business. He established foundations that operated systematically, bringing together experts to address social problems. These foundations worked not just to provide temporary relief, but to create lasting change, improving health, advancing education, and fostering scientific discovery. Among his most lasting contributions was his support for medical research. He funded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which became a pioneer in studying diseases and developing treatments. He supported campaigns that virtually eradicated hookworm in the American South, transforming the health and productivity of entire regions. He backed efforts to fight malaria, yellow fever, and other afflictions that had plagued humanity for centuries. Through these initiatives, his wealth touched lives far beyond the oil fields and refineries from which it had come. At the same time, Rockefeller's personal faith continued to shape his giving. He saw himself as a steward of God's resources, bound to use them for the betterment of humanity. His gifts to churches, missionaries, and religious institutions were immense, driven not by public image but by private conviction. He gave because he believed it was right, because it was part of his duty as a Christian, and because he had promised in his youth that he would devote a portion of all his earnings to charity. The paradox of Rockefeller's life, ruthless businessman and generous philanthropist, remained a subject of debate long after his time. To some, the good he did with his fortune outweighed the methods by which he earned it. To others, the harm done by monopolistic practices could not be erased by later generosity. Yet in the end, both images coexisted, and perhaps it was in that tension that the full measure of his character could be seen. He was both the octopus of the political cartoon and the benefactor of universities and hospitals. He was both the stern, calculating businessman and the gentle grandfather playing golf and handing out dimes to children. By the early 20th century, Rockefeller had given away hundreds of millions of dollars, a sum unmatched in his era. He lived to see the fruits of his philanthropy, to witness the growth of the University of Chicago, the discoveries of the Rockefeller Institute, and the improvement of public health in America and abroad. He also lived long enough to see the government dismantle Standard Oil, declaring it a monopoly in violation of antitrust laws. In that moment, his business empire was broken into pieces, but his philanthropic empire endured, continuing to shape the world in ways that would last for generations. In the quiet of his later years, Rockefeller often reflected on his journey. He had begun as a boy with a ledger and a habit of saving pennies, and he had ended as the richest man of his age, a man whose wealth had built institutions, cured diseases, and educated generations. He believed that he had fulfilled his duty, that he had used his fortune not for indulgence but for service. He saw his life as a testament to discipline, faith, and stewardship. To drift through the story of Rockefeller's wealth and philanthropy is to see not only the rise of a single man, but the shaping of a new idea of wealth itself. Before him, fortunes had been built and spent, but rarely had they been given away on such a scale, with such deliberation, with such a vision for the long-term good of humanity. In Rockefeller's hands, wealth became not just a private treasure, but a public trust, a resource to be managed for the betterment of all. As the night deepens and we let this story settle, we can imagine Rockefeller not in the boardrooms of Standard Oil, but in the quiet study of his later years, writing letters, approving donations, planning campaigns against disease, considering how best to serve the future with the resources of the present. We can picture him walking the green fairways of his estate, pausing to hand a child a dime with a smile, a small gesture from a man whose fortune was beyond comprehension. And we can reflect on the paradox he embodied, the tension between power and generosity, between criticism and gratitude, between the ruthless drive of the businessman and the quiet faith of the philanthropist. In that paradox lies the story of America's first billionaire, a man who was both feared and admired, condemned and celebrated, but who, in the end, left behind not only a fortune, but a legacy of giving that would shape the world long after he was gone. John Davison Rockefeller, the man who would be remembered as America's first billionaire, lived a life that spanned nearly a century, and in those years he witnessed the transformation of a nation. When he was born in 1839, the United States was still a young country, rural in many ways, with its vast frontiers, its growing towns, and its reliance on simple means of light and labor. By the time he died in 1937, airplanes crossed the skies, automobiles filled the roads, radios carried voices into homes across the world, and oil, the resource he had helped to refine and control, had become the lifeblood of modern industry. Yet in the quiet spaces of his personal life, amid the grandeur of this era, Rockefeller was a man of steady habits, deep faith, and surprising simplicity, who found comfort in the ordinary rhythms of daily life. His devotion to family was at the heart of his private world. He married Laura Celestia Spellman in 1864, a woman of intelligence, strong moral conviction, and quiet dignity. She was the daughter of a prosperous Ohio family, raised with the same values of thrift, faith, and hard work that guided Rockefeller himself. Their marriage was a true partnership, with Laura offering balance to John's intensity, providing warmth and grounding to a man whose business dealings often demanded cold calculation. Together, they raised 5 children, though one, their eldest daughter, died in infancy, a sorrow that remained with them always. The surviving children, Bessie, Alta, Edith, and John Jr., grew up in an environment shaped by discipline, religious devotion, and a sense of responsibility that mirrored their father's own upbringing. Rockefeller was not a father given to extravagance or indulgence. He believed that wealth, if not carefully managed, could corrupt character. Thus, he instilled in his children the values of modesty, hard work, and service. He wanted them to understand that money was a trust, not a toy, and that their lives should be guided not by luxury, but by purpose. Yet, for all his seriousness, he could be playful. He enjoyed simple games, light-hearted jokes, and the delight of spending time with his family. He carried a softness into his home that contrasted with the steely determination he showed in his business life. As the years passed and Rockefeller's wealth grew to levels no man before him had known, he chose not to surround himself with gaudy symbols of excess. Though he owned estates, he preferred quiet and comfort to ostentation. His primary residence became Kikuit, a grand estate in Pocantico Hills, New York, overlooking the Hudson River. While Kikuit was elegant, filled with gardens, terraces, and fountains, it reflected his love of order and his appreciation for beauty rather than a desire to dazzle. He delighted in the grounds, in walking among the flowers and trees, in watching the seasons turn across the hills and river. The estate was a retreat, a place where he could step away from the controversies and pressures of public life and find peace among his family and his gardens. Rockefeller's personal faith was a constant presence in his life. From his earliest days, he had been a devout Baptist, and he carried that devotion into his old age. He read the Bible daily, prayed faithfully, and remained active in church life. His faith was not merely ritual, but the foundation of his worldview. It guided his giving, shaped his sense of duty, and provided him with comfort through trials and criticisms. To him, every blessing, every dollar earned, and every challenge faced was part of a divine plan. He saw himself as a steward of God's gifts, responsible for using them wisely. In his later years, Rockefeller's health became a subject of fascination to many. He had suffered from digestive troubles and alopecia. the latter causing him to lose much of his hair, which gave him a distinctive appearance, smooth scalp, often covered by a hat, and small, sharp features that seemed to reflect his keen, orderly mind. Doctors often predicted that his health would fail, but he outlived nearly all of them, reaching the astonishing age of 97. He attributed his longevity to moderation, discipline, and faith. He ate simple meals, rose early, and retired early. He enjoyed fresh air, long walks, and golf, which became one of his favorite pastimes. On the golf course, he was cheerful, competitive, and animated, relishing the simple joys of the game. One of the most enduring images of Rockefeller in his later years is that of him handing out dimes to children. Wherever he went, he carried shiny 10-cent coins, and he delighted in pressing them into the hands of youngsters, a small gesture that became a kind of signature. Some saw it as eccentric, others as symbolic of his belief in thrift and saving, teaching children that even small amounts of money should be valued. For Rockefeller, it was a way to connect with people, to offer a token of goodwill, and perhaps to remind himself of the humble beginnings from which he had risen. Despite his immense fortune, Rockefeller often lived with surprising restraint. His meals were plain, simple bread, milk, vegetables, sometimes a bit of meat. He never indulged in the feasts and banquets that many wealthy men of his era enjoyed. He maintained his habits of careful bookkeeping, continuing to record expenses even when the sums involved were trivial compared to his wealth. It was as though he never forgot the young man who had once counted every penny, who had saved nickels and dimes to help support his family. That memory stayed with him, shaping his outlook until the end. His relationship with the public remained complex. While his philanthropy had transformed universities, medical research, and public health, many still remembered him primarily as the head of Standard Oil, the monopolist whose empire had been broken up by the government. Yet, as the years softened perspectives, more people began to see him as a benefactor, a man whose wealth had been used to advance science, cure diseases, and build institutions that outlived him. His own demeanor in retirement was calm and genial, so different from the caricatures that had once portrayed him as a ruthless octopus of industry. As the decades passed, Rockefeller became almost a symbol of another era, a living link to the Gilded Age. He had known Lincoln as a young man, lived through the Civil War, witnessed the rise of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, seen electricity transform the night, watched the automobile revolutionize travel, and even glimpsed the dawn of aviation. His life stretched across a century of extraordinary change, and he seemed to embody both the promise and the contradictions of that age. In his final years, he spent most of his time at his Florida estate in Ormond Beach, enjoying the warmth and the sea air. There, he continued his routines, his golf, his quiet meals, and his time with family. Visitors often remarked on his gentleness, his humor, his kindness. Though frail in body, he remained sharp in mind, attentive to details, curious about the world, and deeply interested in the lives of his children and grandchildren. On May 23, 1937, John D. Rockefeller passed away in his sleep at the age of 97. He had lived a life longer than most could imagine, one that began before the Civil War and ended on the eve of World War II. His death marked the passing of an era, the close of a chapter in American history in which fortunes had been built, monopolies challenged, and philanthropy redefined. He left behind not only a vast family and a towering legacy of institutions, but also the memory of a man who, despite wealth beyond measure, had lived with discipline, simplicity, and faith. In the quiet reflections of his personal life and later years, we see not the magnate who dominated industries, but the husband, father, grandfather, and man of faith who sought peace in his gardens, joy on the golf course, and purpose in his giving. We see a man who, even when carrying the title of the richest in the world, remained rooted in habits of modesty and discipline. We see a figure who handed out dimes to children, who recorded every penny, who found comfort not in riches but in faith and family. And in this image, softened by time and memory, we glimpse the full measure of John D. Rockefeller, not only as America's first billionaire, but as a man who lived nearly a century with quiet determination, enduring faith, and a legacy that continues to shape the world long after his passing. John D. Rockefeller's legacy is not contained within the years of his lifetime alone. It stretches far beyond his death in 1937, living on in the institutions he built, the causes he championed, and the wealth that flowed through his family into the world. When one speaks of Rockefeller, one speaks not merely of a man, but of a force that helped shape the modern era. His story is inseparable from the story of American capitalism, of philanthropy as a new kind of civic duty, and of the power that one individual's vision can wield across generations. Yet his legacy is as complex as the man himself, celebrated for its generosity, criticized for its origins, and endlessly discussed in the corridors of history. At the heart of Rockefeller's legacy lies his philanthropy, the systematic giving that transformed the idea of charity into something larger, more enduring, more scientific. From his earliest days, he had been taught that wealth was a trust from God, to be used wisely. He carried this conviction throughout his career, believing that to hoard riches for personal indulgence was to misuse the blessings he had been given. For him, giving was not merely an act of kindness, but an obligation, a responsibility as sacred as the earning of money itself. As his fortune grew, so too did his vision of what philanthropy could achieve. In the realm of education, Rockefeller's influence is immense. He endowed the University of Chicago in 1890, providing funds that transformed it from a small Baptist college into one of the leading universities in the world. He believed that higher education, when properly supported, could unlock human potential, cultivate knowledge, and prepare leaders for the future. The University of Chicago became a powerhouse of research and scholarship, attracting some of the greatest minds of its time. Laboratories were built, libraries expanded, and disciplines advanced, all under the steady financial support that flowed from Rockefeller's fortune. The institution became a living monument to his belief in learning as a force for progress, and to this day, its reputation carries echoes of the vision that launched it. Rockefeller's philanthropy did not stop at universities. He established the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913, a body designed to coordinate and expand his giving in ways that would have lasting impact. The foundation took as its mission the advancement of science, public health, and education, guided by the principle of the well-being of mankind throughout the world. With this charter, Rockefeller's wealth began to flow into causes that transcended national boundaries. One of the foundation's greatest achievements was its work in medicine and public health. It funded campaigns to eradicate hookworm in the American South, a disease that had plagued poor communities and stunted the development of entire regions. Through organized effort, research, and education, the foundation helped reduce the prevalence of the parasite, improving health and productivity for countless individuals. In a similar way, the foundation played a crucial role in the development of medical research as a profession. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, later renamed Rockefeller University, became a center of scientific discovery. It supported work that led to breakthroughs in understanding disease, immunology, and biology. The very idea that medicine could be pursued systematically with rigorous research and institutional support was strengthened by Rockefeller's vision. In this, he helped lay the groundwork for modern biomedical science, a legacy that continues in every laboratory and hospital that follows the model of research-driven medicine. The impact of Rockefeller philanthropy was also global. The foundation sent funds, researchers, and medical teams across continents, battling diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and hookworm in far-flung regions. In China, Latin America, and Africa, programs supported by Rockefeller brought education, health campaigns, and infrastructure that altered local realities. This international reach was unprecedented, reflecting Rockefeller's conviction that wealth carried responsibilities not just to one's own community, but to the entire human family. The notion of global philanthropy, so common today, was in many ways pioneered by his example. Yet, for all his giving, Rockefeller's legacy has never been free from controversy. Critics have long argued that the money which funded schools, hospitals, and medical research was earned through monopolistic practices, ruthless competition, and the crushing of rivals during the rise of Standard Oil. To them, his philanthropy was a way of cleansing a reputation stained by the methods of his business. They accused him of buying goodwill, of using charity as a mask for greed. Others, however, saw in his giving a genuine faith in the power of wealth to do good, an attempt to redeem the rough edges of capitalism by investing in humanity's progress. The truth, as with much of Rockefeller's life, lies in the tension between these views. His legacy is both a record of unprecedented generosity and a reminder of the sharp inequalities of the Gilded Age that made such fortunes possible. Rockefeller's influence extended through his family as well. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., carried forward the philanthropic vision with vigor, funding projects such as the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, the construction of Rockefeller Center in New York City, and the support of countless educational and cultural institutions. Jr. inherited not only wealth, but a sense of duty instilled by his father. The family continued through subsequent generations to play a role in public life, in politics, in conservation, and in philanthropy. Nelson Rockefeller, John D.'s grandson, became governor of New York and vice president of the United States, while others in the family supported causes ranging from the arts to environmental preservation. The Rockefeller name became synonymous with influence, not merely through business, but through civic engagement and cultural patronage. One of the less tangible yet deeply felt aspects of Rockefeller's legacy is the way he changed the very concept of giving. Before him, charity was often a matter of local alms, of individuals donating small amounts to churches or local institutions. Rockefeller, influenced by the efficiency of business and the order of his own habits, applied systematic thinking to philanthropy. He believed in research, in planning, in creating institutions that could endure beyond a single gift. His giving was not random but strategic, aimed at solving problems at their roots. This approach influenced later philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and Bill Gates, who saw in Rockefeller's model a blueprint for how great wealth could be harnessed for human progress. His legacy can also be read in the physical and cultural landscape of America. The universities, foundations, museums, and medical centers that bear his name or were funded by his fortune continue to shape lives daily. Students walk halls built with Rockefeller funds, patients are treated in hospitals supported by his giving, and researchers pursue cures in laboratories that exist because of his vision. In this sense, his legacy is not merely historical but living, woven into the fabric of everyday life. And yet, The figure of Rockefeller himself still looms, complex and enigmatic. Was he the ruthless monopolist, crushing competition with an iron hand, or the benevolent benefactor, handing out dimes to children and funding cures for disease? Was he a man of cold calculation, or one of deep faith? History answers with both yes and no, for Rockefeller was all of these at once, a man whose contradictions mirrored the contradictions of the era in which he lived. His legacy invites reflection not only on what he did, but on the broader questions of wealth, power, and responsibility in society. As time passes, the sharp edges of controversy soften, and what remains most vivid is the scale of his impact. The boy from upstate New York, who once earned pennies selling candy, who kept careful ledgers of every cent, grew into a man whose fortune reshaped the course of education, science, and public health. He did not simply live in history, he helped to make it, leaving behind a legacy so vast that it cannot be measured solely in dollars, but in lives touched, institutions built, and ideas set in motion. Even now, nearly a century after his death, the name Rockefeller carries weight. It evokes images of wealth, power, generosity, and controversy. It invites both admiration and criticism, fascination and debate. And in that enduring presence, in that mixture of reverence and scrutiny, lies perhaps the truest measure of his legacy, that he was a man whose life left an indelible mark upon the world, whose influence continues to ripple outward long after his footsteps have faded into history.